Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Nature's Way. On this first episode, I sat down with Vivian Legge of Figure Australia to discuss the Talmud of Emmanuel and the alternative historical narrative that the book presents on the life of Jesus. Um, there's a few twists and turns that I think a few of you may not have heard about, and you'll find it quite interesting, so stay tuned. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the podcast Nature's Way. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our goal for the show is to explore and discuss the laws of nature. In today's show, we're going to discuss the teachings of Billy Meier. Billy's teachings are said to be a roadmap fundamentally based on the laws of nature and creation, and a guide for those who are interested in learning how to navigate their life, thoughts, and feelings according to these laws. Joining us this evening to tell us a little bit about Billy and his teachings is Vivian Legge of Figure Australia. Welcome, Vivian.
Hi, Dalda. Thanks very much for having me on tonight.
Well, thank you for joining us. I'd like to begin, Vivian, by making an important note for our listeners. Nothing we say should be believed, but rather we encourage our listeners to take the time to research the information that's being presented and dissect it to see if they can find any truth and value in it. Would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, that's an extremely important point because the whole teaching that Billy Meier presents is based on the idea that we're evolving. We're evolving in our consciousness and love, knowledge, and wisdom. And for that process to take place, you need to be able to explore the information, explore what you're learning, and explore the ideas and make them your own through experience. And if you believe something, if you believe even the true information, then how can you allow that process to take place? Because you don't question. When you have belief, you're not questioning. So it's the essential process of questioning and exploring that makes this information of value. And so we actually discourage people who say, well, I believe Billy Meier. You're not going to get the value out of it. It'll be an obstacle if it is a belief.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. Well, I think we should dive right in then. Could you start by telling us in a nutshell who Billy Meier is and the mission of Figure?
Yes, well, a nutshell is tricky with Billy because it's such a huge story with so many dimensions, but I'll make it as brief as I can. Billy is a elderly Swiss man. Several decades ago already, he took it upon himself the very difficult task of bringing what's called the renewed teaching of the truth to earth humanity. This is the teaching of the prophets. This is prophets being just teachers, really, great teachers. This is information that's said to have been brought over the eons to earth humanity by prophets. Billy has taken it upon himself to bring this teaching to earth humanity now. And it's a teaching based on knowledge, not belief. And part of the teaching is having us understand the context in which this teaching comes. So it's not only important for him to present teaching that, to do with how we direct our thoughts, our feelings, and how we align ourselves with what's termed the laws of creation. But it's also important that we understand the context, so we understand where this teaching has come from in the past, why it's been presented the way it is now. And part of that information involves bringing to our awareness the reality of extraterrestrial life. And so Billy is being assisted in this unusual mission by some people called the Pliaren. And these people are extraterrestrial human beings. They're not super beings, they're just extra long-lived in relation to our lifespan. Human beings that come from not the Pleiades, but these are the Pleiades, and they come from a star system that's beyond the Pleiades. It's just that the Pleiades is the closest star system that we can recognise in our space and time dimension. That's another story in and of itself, but they live beyond the Pleiades, but have been associated with the Pleiades because of that location and recognisability of the Pleiades to us. And so Billy's task has been not only to produce spiritual teaching, he also has had to produce the evidence of the extraterrestrial involvement in his mission. And many people may already know of his photographs that he produced in the mid-70s. He was basically directed to make these pictures of the extraterrestrial craft, and these are extraordinary pictures, very close up, daylight, hundreds of pictures, photographs, also movie footage, sound samples. The pictures show reflections of light. They show the play of the sun on the hillsides and this sort of thing, things that can't be faked. And so he produced this evidence, and the point was that it would cause people to begin the discussion about the reality of extraterrestrials and to share opinions and to debate this. And there are definitely elements of controversy and things that cause great debates and arguments within the body of evidence. Yeah. And the whole point, as they state, is not just to be impressive and persuade people with their remarkable evidence, but to actually prompt thought and discussion and debate. And certainly anyone who's involved in this information knows debates, quite heated debates, rage and have raged over the decades about the validity of the evidence. But the whole point is to make people think and come to an understanding through their own reason and logic, if that's what they choose to do.
Right.
So Billy has presented teaching, has presented evidence, and has given all sorts of other explanations. And FIGU is the organisation that surrounds Billy Meier, and it's simply a collection of volunteers who've taken it upon themselves for their own reasons to play a role in making sure this information is available for people who want it to scrutinise.
Personally, for me, I never thought it was a stretch to, when you think about the vastness of the universe, we're nothing but a speck of dust, and I don't think it's a stretch at all to think that there are many more, evolved civilizations out there, maybe further ahead of us, and some just at the early stages of their development. Billy has written many books in German, most of which have been translated. However, those books have to go through a painstaking process before they're released and translated into English or whatever language they're translated into. Could you just go over that for us and give us the reasons behind this meticulous process?
Okay, now I think I just heard you say most of them are translated, but actually most of them are not translated. He's written more than 40 books and many other texts and pamphlets and so forth, and actually very, very few of these texts have been translated.
Okay, excuse me for that. Sorry, that was a mistake on my part. Go ahead.
Now there is a useful little collection at this point. And once you've given the references towards the end for the web pages people can go to, people can start to look at those. But they cover a lot of ground, but they're by no means more than just a fairly small sample of what he's produced. He's just produced an enormous amount. And yes, the translation process is very painstaking. And the reason is the texts were produced originally in German, in the German language, and this is said to be because it's the language that most closely resembles the Lyran language, which is the language of the forefathers who in ancient times came to Earth. And various languages evolved on Earth, and some moved further away from that language than others. But one that remained the closest was the one that remained the closest to that was German. And the reason that this is used is because this language is capable of delivering a lot more accuracy and detail. That's not something that just Billy Meyer says. That is something that's acknowledged even in the Webster's Dictionary, the American Webster's Dictionary from turn of the previous century. There's quite an interesting explanation about how the English language compared to the German is poor in expression.
Yeah.
And is made up of a lot of different languages and it's a hodgepodge. The German expresses so much more. For instance, the large words are basically made up of small words that you can recognise the meaning of the small words within the large words, and it aids thinking. And that's another point that the Webster's Dictionary made, that if you can see the components of the words that you're reading and you can recognise those components as you go, this is facilitating the way you think. So it's no small matter, since this whole teaching is based on thinking, the power of the consciousness, the evolution of the consciousness for the sake of the evolution of the spirit form, then what you do with your consciousness is very important. And this teaching is not just presented for this time, it's presented for, for forever, really. It's intended for people to use in the next centuries. It's not just us. And we will develop our ability to sort of think in greater detail. It's a bit like having a very fine paintbrush. If you're an artist, you can create a picture that has extraordinary detail and is therefore much more accurate. You can still do a kind of a job with a coarser paintbrush, but you are going to distort the image in doing so, even though it's far better than not having an image.
Right. Well, that's very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. And you've also over the last few years been involved in translating a book, The Way to Live. Is that right?
Well, that's the one we worked on in the last couple of years, The Way to Live. As the title suggests, it's a fantastic encapsulation of a whole lot of advice across the board, which is why we thought it was a good one to do. Yes, and a couple of others. Like we have a German-born lady in our group whose skills are invaluable. And this is the thing, you see, we have some people who are quite good in the English language and have learnt quite a lot of German. We have some people who are German-born and have learnt quite a lot of English. And having lived, in English-speaking countries for a long time. So we have to come together and bridge that gap.
Yeah.
But the thing that some people don't recognise is that even when you have quite a high level of skill amongst a group of translators, the original texts are actually very difficult. And I've spoken to a few quite intelligent and very well-educated figure members in Switzerland who have the German, and they find the texts difficult. And sometimes, if we're struggling over a section, we'll go back to one of these people in Switzerland and say, what do you think this means? And they'll say, oh, I don't know, I'll have to ask Billy, So occasionally Billy is asked, but also Billy cannot be asked for all of these things because he's just way too busy. And the figure's stance, because of the limits of the language and because of the limits of the translators, who of course all have their own limitations in different ways, the stance that figure takes is translations into other languages, although these are desirable, are never going to cut the mustard. They're never going to be adequate to convey the real meaning. So you must retain the German text with the English or with the other language that's been translated into, so that the reader always has the option somehow of scrutinising the German at some point if they can.
Okay.
So it is a painstaking process, because how do you, quite long debates and arguments, I don't mean unfriendly arguments, just toing and froing of opinions occur. Which collection of inadequate words will we use to not too badly misrepresent this idea that's in the German, and some words just cannot be conveyed by a collection of English words. And so in some places the reader will discover that the German words are carried over into the English. And this is a reminder to the reader in the English that this is how it is. There just are some words that just do not work, cannot be conveyed. And English continues to get dumbed down. So this is really not a small point.
Right. Well, that makes a lot of sense, and thank you for that. Another book that has been translated and is in the process of being published is the Talmud of Emmanuel, and the Talmud is a book that I'm sure will be quite a controversial book, but and might be a little bit shocking to some, but at the same time, it could be a little bit refreshing. Nonetheless, if what is said in the Talmud is true, and people will of course have to determine that for themselves, the significance of the information is nothing short of amazing and offers an alternative narrative to the historical view of the life of Jesus, or as the Talmud suggests, Jesus should have been correctly named Emmanuel. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, again, this is such a monumental topic. It's hard to just say a few words, but I came to the conclusion that the best way to describe what this book is about and why it's so important is to describe the underlying philosophy behind it that is different to the Christian New Testament, the book of Matthew in particular. It's the teaching of self-responsibility. And I really need to explain this a little bit. As the title suggests, this text is said to be the true story of the life and teaching of Emmanuel, the man who has become known as Jesus.
Yeah.
And it was apparently written down by the disciple Judas, who was not the betrayer. That's another story. But he was the only disciple who could write, according to this information. And this is where I really do have to make an explanation about what is meant by self-responsibility. This teaching of the laws of creation, what it teaches is that we have responsibility for ourselves. And that's not just saying it would be good if you were all took responsibility for yourselves. It's actually saying this is the way you function. This is your creational nature, that you yourself, because of your nature, determine your life. You have the thing in you, the power to determine the way your life goes, whether you're conscious of this or not. It's just the way it is. If this is the case, then you need to be aware of it and to do it responsibly, because at the moment, being unconscious of it, we're causing a lot of destructive damage to ourselves and each other by not taking control, not recognizing that we even have this power over our own lives. So it's describing the self-responsibility as just a fact of nature that you cannot get around. It's just the nature. But the whole basis of the New Testament, the teaching that it was attributed to Emmanuel, called Jesus, is all about giving up that responsibility to a God, to a Saviour. So if you think, for instance, about the crucifixion, which of course is a central teaching for Christians, and I'll, the listeners should understand that I was a Christian. Both my parents were preachers, and I do understand how this is likely to strike people. But the crucifixion, if you think about it, the whole point is you accept Jesus Christ as your Saviour. He takes your sins away. And the self-responsibility teaching is you evolve through learning, through directing your life, through your thoughts in one way or another. And you learn about the nature of things doing this. And a natural part of this process is making mistakes. So if someone saves you from your mistakes, first of all, the implication is that you should be condemned for them. And this teacher said, well, no, it's just natural that you will make them. There's no condemnation appropriate. And secondly, if someone else could save you from your sins, what then? How have you then addressed the mistakes that you're making? So these are the sorts of differences that are reflected in the story presented by the Talmud Emmanuel. Emmanuel was tortured on this. He was nailed to a tree stem that was had the shape of a Y, which was apparently traditionally the way they did it in those circumstances. It was immensely painful. He didn't die. He came close to death and was taken to be dead, but was actually brought back to health secretly by those who secretly recognised that he wasn't dead. And there's another story there. But the point is, the real important point is, he didn't die to save anyone's sins. That was not consistent with this teaching. That would not have been consistent. Makes no sense. You take responsibility for your own mistakes, you work through them, you learn, and then you don't make them again. So these are the sorts of things that are reflected, and you'll hear and you'll read, if you involve yourself with the Talmud Emmanuel, the name Jesus and the name Christ were not his names. That was imposed on him later on. For the same reason, because most people don't realise the word Jesus it basically points back to words that mean Yahweh saves, so the God of the Jews saves. So he was labelled,
and
he
that
was
would
given
again
names.
contradict the teachings, really.
Exactly.
Right.
Because you do it for yourself. Your nature is that you need to find your own way, develop strength within yourself, work out your own mistakes, learn from it, evolve, develop. And if you just hand over your responsibility for your sins to a greater being, where does that leave you? You're not going to be doing that. You're just going to stagnate. So that just wasn't part of it. So but his name, and Christ also means the anointed one, the one, the special one who they're expecting to be their saviour, their Messiah. This was imposed on him, and it just has nothing to do with the teaching. It's far from it. So people think, oh, well, what does it matter? Why quibble over a name? But those whole elements, these key elements, represent the key difference in the texts, that it's a teaching of self-responsibility. And this moves on to, for instance, the healing. It's definitely got a lot of healing going on in this Talmud Emmanuel. It's very encouraging, very refreshing that these things really did happen to a certain extent. But again, the emphasis is, people are saying, oh, heal me. If I just touch your garment, you'll heal me, and so on. And what Emmanuel is doing in the Talmud Emmanuel is going around saying, well, if you believe it, so it's true. And then he explains to them that it was the power of their own consciousness that did that.
Right.
That it's not him, although he had the ability not only to use herbs and salves, and he had some healing knowledge in general, but he had the ability to address people's consciousness at a very deep level. A form of hypnosis is basically could address people's consciousness, which caused them to use their own consciousness to bring about quite extraordinary healings.
And that would make a lot more sense today for anybody, listening. I'm sure they would have heard that really, these skills and science are being developed now. The power of the consciousness is a little bit more understood today than it was maybe back then. So it may have seemed miraculous, to the people at the time, but really it was the power of their own consciousness. Is that what you're suggesting there?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you're right, because, for instance, there are more studies to do with the benefits of meditation, where you achieve a peaceful state of meditation, and it aids in healing. So people are learning about that these days, but also the whole business about the miracles. Anyone who reads this text and expects to find the miracles there is going to be rather disappointed, because a lot of that is not as it was portrayed. There are other explanations. And it seems that a lot of these things were exaggerated by people, followers, and others who wanted to distort the teaching also, because you could tell a good story and get your version of the truth to be spread through these great stories, these persuasive stories of remarkable things, which also serve the purpose of for those who wanted to portray him as a son of God,
Yes.
a divine being. These were things that would make people think he was a divine being. But this is a teaching of equality, and there were no divine beings. That, again, in the context of self-responsibility, Emmanuel certainly was very wise and had this teaching knowledge. But the story is that he developed that through his own efforts, as any other being would have had to do. But through many reincarnations, and also through his own lifetime, where the 40 days and 40 nights where he disappears. He apparently was taken off into a big spaceship hovering above the earth somewhere, and was given, fairly intensive instruction from extraterrestrial teachers who themselves were not angels or super beings, but were just very long-lived by our standards, people who, through their own efforts, had achieved a level of knowledge and wisdom that made them capable of teaching.
If we could just kind of touch on that a little bit more, so that people can really kind of begin to understand the relationship there between, whenever you start getting into speaking about extraterrestrials and stuff like that, it becomes, a little bit hard for people to grasp. But if we consider, all things considered, the size of the universe and so on, and that there are likely evolved, highly evolved beings who have well surpassed our understanding of the universe, and really have learned that there are laws in the universe, that everything basically evolves according to those laws. And so, as I understand it, it was those teachings that were brought to earth, the teachings of the laws of nature, and it was those teachings that Emmanuel was presenting. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. There are universal teachings. So what we say is, and what the teaching explains is, this is not a molded teaching. It's just a teaching that represents what is, from people who have had enough life and learning over innumerable incarnations to be able to describe it, in words and understand it well enough to describe it to someone else. But it's a teaching that would apply anywhere in the universe and would be discovered eventually by anyone just inquiring with their own consciousness. And that's the point of it. That's why it's not a belief system, because anyone can say, well, I'll just have to think this through for myself. Could this be true? And test different parts of it. And what they're saying is that you would come up with the same results were you looking at things accurately and honestly.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Universal teaching, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting you point that out, because from I was a young kid, my father and I, we spent a lot of time going to Indian reservations, and what really fascinated me, and what I loved about the time that I spent there, and some of the interactions we had with the Native American Indians, was that they were in touch with nature, and they really grasped these ideas that we're not separate from nature, we're very much a part of it. This very much ties in with basically the teachings that and just the point that you made, regardless of whether somebody ever came across these teachings of nature and the laws of nature, one would eventually evolve to the understanding that is just the way it is. This is the way the universe works. Is that right?
Yeah, being exposed to nature, you can't help but learn. And in fact, the situation is, it's hard for us to understand that, because we have become removed from that. We don't recognise how far we've become removed from that. One of the main instruction with this is, if you want to learn about the laws of nature, expose yourself to nature, and just, and nature isn't just the physical expression. It's the things behind it. It's the things like the power of your thoughts. It's the things like the what we call swinging waves, but have otherwise been called vibrations, that we emit if we're in a bad mood, a good mood, the sorts of effects we have on each other socially when we're too cramped. These are all also expressions of nature, but we're so removed from nature and actually paying attention. This is a thing that, to me, so much of it just comes back down to that we just don't pay attention. We just adopt an idea because we're impressed by somebody, and we don't actually pay attention ourselves. We can't even concentrate well enough to pay attention to anything, which is why meditation is a central part of this teaching, because if you can't even concentrate, how can you pay attention
Yeah, and
to
especially
reality?
in today's society, we've, with all of the technology, although technology is a great thing, it's really hampered our development, and it's taken us away from the fundamentals of how we're supposed to evolve. And you know we're all guilty, I'm sure. We spend too much time on our phone, too much time on the computer, too much time watching the TV. It's all a distraction, and really is taking us away from this the fundamental ways, and how we can evolve according to the laws of nature. Um,
And it's things like respecting what the weather patterns do.
yeah,
If you have actually done something like gardening, you are forced to respect the laws of nature. You can do certain things to, you can have hot houses and this sort of thing to alter conditions to a certain point. But if it's going to rain for a week, 2 weeks solid, you've got to respect that fact, and you've got to deal with it somehow.
yeah,
You can't just ignore it as if it doesn't exist. But we do ignore it as if it doesn't exist. We build villages in floodplains, and build houses absolutely surrounded by thick, burnable, flammable bush, and wonder why vast areas of the country keep burning, and people's houses destroyed because we don't respect the fact that fire will do that.
yeah. It's funny you
You
say that.
know,
It is something as simple as gardening. I just started gardening a few years ago myself, and I never realized how much of a balance you needed to strike in order to grow a plant. And it was just those simple, it was that simple understanding that, there are certain nutrients that a plant needs. And if, you don't strike that balance and provide those nutrients, the plant isn't going to grow. And if we kind of, you know, basically look at that in terms of, the way our society is in the direction that it's moving right now, we've really got away from that fine balance, and it's almost, um, we're at a tipping point here of it, not working anymore, not growing as we're supposed to.
yeah, there's chaos basically. Chaos is coming about in nature, which makes it very difficult to, create a predictable harvest of this or that or the other, because conditions keep changing. And still we don't change our ways. It's only when things get incredibly bad that it finally dawns on us that we have to do something. But this is the point. And for instance, if we go back to the Talmud, it's you don't condemn mistakes, but serious wrongdoers, people who are murderers or abused children or something. These people are not condemned to death, because what does that serve? How does that serve an evolutionary process? They're certainly put out of harm's way so that they can't harm the community, but they are given a hard situation where they have to grow their own food with very little to help them, very crude tools, this sort of thing, so that they have to reacquaint themselves with the laws of nature. Because obviously the idea behind this is, if you're going to make such serious mistakes as to do that kind of harm, it's because you are out of touch with the way nature has to work. And it's not just to do with whether you need rain to make your potatoes grow, whether you need to take the effort and respect it. certain conditions produce certain things. You also have to understand how love works and what it actually is, that it's based on understanding, not on superficialities. That the more knowledge and wisdom you have, the more love you have. You can't have wisdom without love. You can't have love without wisdom, because it's all to do with respecting truth, being exposed to truth, and developing an understanding of things at a very deep level. At which point you know that if you're harming someone else, you're harming yourself. This sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know that there's nothing good to be achieved. So, you get your stick and your potato, and you're sent out there to educate yourself about the laws of creation.
Right.
Not sent to hell.
That's and I think that's going to be really refreshing for a lot of people. To think that if there's anybody that's just come across this video and are listening, who are from a Christian faith, Christian background, it's you can imagine it's almost torturing to think that you're going through life, and it's impossible not to constantly make mistakes. But for those mistakes, Christian teaches that you might go to hell, and I'm sure it's just refreshing for a lot of people to think that what mistakes are just a part of the process. It's a part of evolving, making mistakes and learning and moving on. But one of the other things, Vivian, that I found really refreshing to hear in the that was presented in the Talmud was that there were 17 female disciples. Is that can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, there isn't an awful lot said about them, just that there were 17 female disciples. There were 12 men.
Yeah.
And 17 female disciples, and Mary Magdalene and Emmanuel's mother. And they took a role. They did much the same as the men in terms of taking a part in also teaching.
Yeah. I think it speaks to the fact that again, it was the information, the real information was corrupted, and it speaks to the fact that in all reality that it was a man's word possibly at that time, and that it was the information was corrupted. So the truth is that there were more people that were presenting this information, and it was apparently 17 female that did so.
Yes, and apparently they had things written. Judas Iscariot was the only disciple who could write, but others had things written by people who could write, and the female disciples did. But apparently, explanation is that all their writings were destroyed, or the ones that they had generated were destroyed, because the man's world just couldn't allow this to be. And one of the parts in the Talmud Emmanuel, when Emmanuel was having a go at the scribes and the Pharisees, and he's criticising the Pharisees very harshly for their treatment of women, that they don't allow the women to be part of the religious ceremonies, and this is the way they treat them in general at home, and this sort of thing. And he really lights into them, and this is at about the point where they're finding a way to find charges against him, so they've got an excuse to get rid of him.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really lighting into them. Now, some people, I find this also interesting, some people ask, well, how come the prophets were men? This is obviously just another, man's thing. And the answer is simply because if they had been women, they would not have been listened to.
Right.
It wouldn't have worked. Because you people are, living in a world that's a man's world, and women aren't respected, it just wouldn't have worked. No one would have respected them.
Yeah. So
that's the only reason, because women, all through this teaching, women are certainly every bit as capable of evolving and having the wisdom and knowledge and taking leadership roles as the men, and the extraterrestrials are certainly represented by various women who have done that, according to the information.
Yeah.
You might be interested, there is just a little section of the Talmud that to my mind, encapsulates teaching rather nicely, where the female disciple Esther comes out after, I think it was the Sermon on the Mount. Emmanuel's finished his bit, he goes away, but people are still hanging around, as you can imagine. They want more. So a couple of the disciples come out, and Esther is recorded as having said, "Search for the truth in everything that is there in reality." This is just my rough translation I'm doing here, so don't,
Oh, no,
but it's more or less this.
Okay.
Pay attention to your thoughts and feelings and direct them in line with the truth, so that you have direct them in line with the truth that you have found, so that you attain true knowledge from it. So respect reality, pay attention to reality, find the truth there, align your thoughts and feelings with the truth. This brings you harmony. Respect and honour the people around you, your family, your friends, your acquaintances. This brings harmony. This brings peace. If you do these things, if you align yourself with the truth that you pay attention to in reality, then life will be peaceful and the community will be righteous.
Yeah.
That's basically what her sermon, her little lesson there. And it's so clean. It's so...
Yeah, it's beautiful.
If it's not there, if it's not there in reality for you to discover through your honest inquiry, don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
If it is there, follow it and align yourself with it and respect it. And that's the teaching, So the equality teaching stretches not only from the females, it's all, female-male equality, absolutely, but also, and how different our world would be if our central religious teachings had not taught otherwise. But the other equality thing is, I hadn't really done justice to that, is under no circumstances do you put a teacher on a pedestal and worship him or her, because everybody who has this great wisdom has come by it in the natural way, step by step through the process of evolution. So it's not a God-given thing that just falls into someone's lap. It's something that's worked hard for. And you, of course, respect a great teacher for the fact that he or she is a great teacher, and you obviously pay attention to those facts and take that into consideration, but you do not lower yourself. You do not put yourself on the ground in front of them, because you yourself have that potential to develop, and you yourself are on your own path of evolution, which is every bit as valuable.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word prophet, there's going to be people that listen here and hear the word prophet, and they're going to think, oh no, it's another religion. But the word prophet is simply, the meaning of it is teacher. And I've even heard that Billy doesn't necessarily like the word or being called prophet. He prefers the term teacher. Could you speak to that a little bit? I mean, it's often,
well, that's pretty much it. That the word prophet has been used, and of course the prophets did provide prophecy. If you don't change your ways, then this, that, and the other thing is going to happen. That's obviously a very important part of what they had to do to bring the bad news of, basically put it to people. But they were doing this in the greater context of being teachers in all regards, in terms of the teaching of life. And yes, Billy has quite recently in particular made that known, that it is a problematic term. And all of these terms, of course, are hard to get your mind around if you have seen them in a religious context. But isn't it curious that you sort of hear about the prophets and the teaching of the prophets when you read the Bible, and yet who are they and why? What relationship did they have with Jesus? And they just were these prophets.
Right.
In the Talmud, Emmanuel also criticizes the Pharisees and the scribes harshly for sitting on the seat of the prophets, as it were, to putting themselves in the position of the prophets who had always provided this teaching of life, the teaching of the truth, and basically distorting it and confusing people with their own versions.
Yeah, I don't think, considering the corruption even today in politics and religion, it's not far-fetched that the powers that be at the time, the Pharisees, would have felt threatened by the teachings of Emmanuel. The teachings of nature really decentralized the power, and basically gave it back to the people, because it was a teaching that was of self responsibility. It was something people could really learn to make decisions for themselves.
Mm. And that's right. It's to do with power. Power is a neutral thing. I know, I am aware that coming from a Christian background, I used to hear the word power. You can be powerful and think, oh dear, that sort of sounds like that's bad,
Yeah.
But it's a neutral term. It's a neutral term that you can use this power for great good, of course, or you can use it for great evil. And if an individual has power, I mean, the teaching is that we simply do have great power. It's just that we don't take control of how we use it. So we are affecting things enormously anyway. And I think that's the thing that people don't appreciate, even people who study this teaching, that we are not actually aware of the enormous power that we already have, because we're always looking outwardly and attributing this power. There's things that happen in our lives, we're attributing that to God, or some other great being other than ourselves. And that, in fact, we haven't described where this whole God thing came from, that there was this figure of an Ish, which is a king of wisdom.
Yeah, could you make that
Queen of
connection for
wisdom.
us? The,
Yes.
the connection with the Pleiaren and the go ahead there. Sorry.
Yes, of course. I was realising that, this is kind of a central point, and we hadn't even really dealt with it. But all through the Talmud Emmanuel's saying, I'm not the Son of God, and in fact, God is a fantasy figure. What there was always these characters, these people with very high levels of learning in the laws of creation, love, knowledge, and wisdom, the very highest possible learning, by no means perfect, but the very highest possible learning. And they were called kings or queens of wisdom, which is represented by the letters, let's get this right, Ishwish was the way the word comes out, so it's JWHW, is that right? Yes. And those four letters, Ishwish, actually are letters that have come to mean the Jewish God, Yahweh. But it originally just referred to someone who had a great level of knowledge and wisdom. So these, historically, in the time of Emmanuel, these were the Pleiaren people again.
So they were misunderstood. Those words were misunderstood and misrepresented. Is that what
because in ancient times there were people who came, the ancestors of the Pleiaren, who came to Earth and misrepresented themselves as gods, set themselves up as creator gods, and misled the people.
Right.
And so the Pleiaren extraterrestrials specifically feel it's their task to try and correct that situation and educate people now that they can more easily, in a time when we're more reasonable, educate them about who those people were, what really happened, and that this was a deceit, and that the real power that we use as a guide and that empowers us is creation itself, from which we come.
Yeah, and that's not to be confused that the Pleiaren are somehow, getting involved in manipulating the way that we evolve here. It's not like that at all. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, a lot of people sort of fear that, because obviously they're saying this is what's happened in the past, that you have been misled and manipulated by advanced extraterrestrial people who could take advantage of your ignorance. But the Pleiaren, they have a different sense. They're more evolved. They are a peaceful people. And anyone who's concerned about that, I say, look, study the teaching that they present, because how would it be that they would provide a teaching that taught you to think for yourself and become strong and examine everything, question everything that they say? How would that be a malevolent thing to do? This is my challenge to anyone who feels that these are actually up to no good. Why would they provide such a healthy teaching, the result of which is love, harmony, and peace? So again, reason and logic is what we need to use to try and figure out whether their goals are really as they say they are.
Mm-hmm. Can you tie this all in with Billy Meyer and how that relates to the mission today and the mission of Figure?
Oh, well, Billy's had this ongoing relationship with the Pliaran. They taught him as a child, as their forefathers also taught Emmanuel as a child. So because of the terrible state of our warring and destruction over millennia on Earth, it was determined that we needed this series of prophets. Billy is the seventh in a series of prophets. And the Pliaran, there was Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, Muhammad, and now Billy. And all of their teachings were, all of this teaching, which is the same one teaching, it didn't vary over the eons, it was corrupted time and time again. And so now it's being delivered again, and the Pliaran are just assisting Billy in this process. They have the perspective of knowing the history of the migrations from other planets in ancient times, and so they're providing all of that information. And it's simply that. It's information for people to consider through their own choice. We absolutely do not try and force it on anybody. That's the whole thing. People have their own choice.
There's nothing to believe. Of course, there are certain aspects of the material that maybe a stretch for some people, and some of that information. You kind of once you come across the information and you start to learn of there was a big investigation into the Billy Meyer material, and as I understand it, it was back in the 70s, at a time when there was very little technology that could have manipulated the photographic evidence and stuff that Billy had presented. So once a person delves into that information and comes to the conclusion that this is in fact the information that he's presenting is in fact real, if that's what they find, then in some ways you are putting a little bit of I don't want to use the word faith because that would be the wrong
We
word.
use the word trust.
Trust.
In the sense that if
That's
someone has a track record for producing things that turn out to be right time and time again, you do come to trust them, but it's always a mistake to think that they're infallible.
Right.
And they say themselves that this is not the perfect truth. It's just, it's the best that we can do at this stage. And so while you can legitimately develop a trust in someone who keeps producing things that turn out to be correct time and time again, it's not a bad thing when there is something in there that really throws you into enormous doubt, because what it does is it causes you to fall back on your own resources. You just so want to ask someone else and say, is this true? But you can't. This person that you've come to trust, you think, what about this? This doesn't make sense. And you struggle and you strain and you think, well, I don't know, but I think this is true because you've had your own personal experience, and it's not in the end about Billy Meyer. He's just delivering something. He's just a messenger. It's not about the Pliaran extraterrestrials. They're just human beings who are also just on a mission. It's about what you discover about the truth of life for yourself. So that's the point. So those moments when you doubt enormously because of some bizarre thing that's come up, or evidence that seems to go against it, you think to yourself, well, this is the point. This is the stated point of the whole thing. Think for yourself. Work it out for yourself. Draw from those resources that you didn't even know you had to figure these things out.
It's encouraged to question everything, not to take anything at face value. Dive into the material and really dissect it piece by piece, and that's where the value is.
That's the point.
Yeah. The book that the Talmud of Emmanuel. There was a book written by a man named Howard Martin. He wrote the King of Travelers, and as I understand it, the King of Travelers, Howard Martin, spent years researching the evidence that Emmanuel didn't die on the cross. In fact, he was taken down off the cross and nursed back to health, and then moved to India and actually lived till he was 110. Is that right?
He wound up in Kashmir, according to this story. That's right. He married and had a big family. And the point is that the teaching was intended for everyone, not just one particular race. It was intended for all of humanity. So he did actually spend many, many years teaching over in India and I think in Afghanistan area, and wound up in Kashmir. That's right.
So the book, the Talmud, when can people expect to? Do you know when it's supposed to be released?
Well, we understand it's going to be done by the end of this year.
Mm-hmm.
So, and when it is, it will be announced and available through the Figu web pages. So we have one in Australia, there's one in Canada. Michael Horn at theyfly.com, he will also have them, no doubt, and also in Switzerland they'll have them. So depending on where you live, those are some options for getting hold of one. It's the Canada group that's actually doing organising the publication. So if anyone is interested in finding out more specifically about that, you can approach them.
Well, I think that that really explains a lot, Vivian, and thanks very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity, because as you know, it's that not many opportunities arise because this is very confronting information. So thank you for getting the conversation going.
Well, it's my pleasure, Vivian. Thank you, and I hope to have you on again in the near future. Maybe we can dive into a little bit more on the information that was given by Billy.
Sure, I would love to do that.
Well, thank you. Bye bye.